Chapter 16 of Discoveries Among the Ruins of Nineveh and Babylon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sabrina Jazz Ainsworth. Discoveries Among the Ruins of Nineveh and Babylon by Austen Layard. Chapter 16. Discoveries at Kuyunjik, procession of figures bearing fruit and game, locusts, led horses, an Assyrian campaign, Dagon or the fish god, the chambers of records, inscribed clay tablets, return to Nimrud, effects of the flood, discoveries, small temple under high mound, the evil spirit, fish god, fine bas-relief of the king, extracts from the inscription, great inscribed monolith, extracts from the inscription, cedar beams, small objects, second temple, marble figure and other objects. During my absence in the desert, the excavations at Kuyunjik had been actively carried on under the superintendence of Tomer Shishman. On my arrival, he described many interesting discoveries, and I hastened to the ruins, crossing in a rude ferry boat the river, now swollen by the spring rains, to more than double its usual size. The earth had been completely removed from the sides of the long gallery, on the walls of which had been portrayed the transport of the large stone and of the winged bulls. An outlet was discovered near its western end, opening into a narrow descending passage, an entrance, it would appear, into the palace from the river side. Its length was 96 feet, its breadth not more than 13. The walls were panelled with sculptured slabs about 6 feet high. Those to the right, in descending, represented a procession of servants carrying fruit, flowers, game, and supplies for a banquet, preceded by mace-bearers. The first servant, following the guard, bore an object which I should not hesitate to identify with the pineapple, unless there were every reason to believe that the Assyrians were unacquainted with that fruit. The leaves sprouting from the top proved that it was not the cone of a pine tree or fir. After all, the sacred symbol held by the winged figures in the Assyrian sculptures may be the same fruit, and not, as I have conjectured, that of a coniferous tree. The attendants who followed carried clusters of ripe dates and flat baskets of osier work, filled with pomegranates, apples, and bunches of grapes. They raised in one hand small green boughs to drive away the flies. Then came men bearing hares, partridges, and dried locusts fastened on rods. The locust has ever been an article of food in the East, and is still sold in the markets of many towns in Arabia. Being introduced in this bas-relief amongst the choice delicacies of a banquet, it was probably highly prized by the Assyrians. The locust bearers were followed by a man with strings of pomegranates. Then came, 2 by 2, attendants carrying on their shoulders low tables, such as are still used in the East at feasts, loaded with baskets of cakes and fruits of various kinds. The procession was finished by a long line of servants bearing vases of flowers. These figures were dressed in a short tunic, confined at the waist by a shawl or girdle. They wore no headgear, their hair falling in curls on their shoulders. On the opposite walls of the passage were 14 horses without trappings, each horse having a simple halter twisted around its lower jaw, by which it was led by a groom. The animals and men were designed with considerable truth and spirit. It is probable that the sculpture forming the upper end of the passage, but now entirely destroyed, represented the king receiving this double procession. The passage may have led to the banqueting hall, or to a chamber where royal feasts were sometimes held, and was therefore adorned with appropriate subjects. At its western end, the gallery turned abruptly to the north, its walls being there built of solid stone masonry. I lost all further traces of it, as the workmen were unable, at that time, to carry on the tunnel beneath an accumulated mass of earth and rubbish about 40 feet thick. As the workmen could no longer, without some danger, excavate in this part of the ruins, they had returned to the chamber already described as containing a series of bas-reliefs representing the capture and sack of a large city in the mountains, and as opening into the broad gallery on whose walls were depicted the various processes employed by the Assyrians in moving their colossal figures. From this chamber branched to the south a narrow passage, whose sculptured panels had been purposely destroyed. It led into a great hall, which the workmen did not then explore. They continued for a few feet along its western side, and then turning through a doorway, discovered a chamber from which again, always following the line of wall, they entered a spacious apartment, completely surrounded with bas-reliefs, representing one continuous subject. The Assyrian army was seen fording a broad river amidst wooded mountains. The king in his chariot was followed by a long retinue of warriors on foot and on horses, richly caparisoned, by led horses with even gayer trappings, and by men bearing on their shoulders his second chariot, which had a yoke ornamented with bosses and carvings. After crossing the river, they attacked the enemy's strongholds, which they captured one by one, putting to death or carrying into captivity their inhabitants. The captives wore a kind of turban wrapped in several folds round the head, and a short tunic confined at the waist by a broad belt. From the nature of the country, it may be conjectured that the sculptures represented a campaign in some part of Armenia, and I am inclined to identify the river with the Euphrates, near whose headwaters, as we learn from the bull inscriptions, Sennacherib waged one of his most important wars. The slabs at the western end of this chamber were actually curved backwards, showing the enormous pressure that must have taken place from the falling in of the upper part of the building, by which not only the alabaster was bent, but driven into the wall of sundry bricks. On the north side of the chamber were two doorways leading into separate apartments. Each entrance was formed by two colossal bas-reliefs of Dagon, or the fish god. Unfortunately, the upper part of all these figures had been destroyed, but as the lower remained from above the waist, we can have no difficulty in restoring the whole, especially as the same image is seen entire on a fine Assyrian cylinder of agate in my possession. It combined the human shape with that of the fish. The head of the fish formed a mitre above that of the man, whilst its scaly back and fan-like tail fell as a cloak behind, leaving the human limbs and feet exposed. The figure wore a fringed tunic, and bore the two sacred emblems, the basket and the cone. We can scarcely hesitate to identify this mythic form with the Oannes, or sacred manfish, who, according to the traditions preserved by Berosus, issued from the Erythraean Sea, instructed the Chaldeans in all wisdom, in the sciences, and in the fine arts, and was afterwards worshipped as a god in the temples of Babylonia. Its body, says the historian, was that of a fish, but under the head of a fish was that of a man, and to its tail were joined women's feet. 5 such monsters rose from the Persian Gulf at fabulous intervals of time. The Dagon of the Philistines and of the inhabitants of the Phoenician coast was worshipped, according to the united opinion of the Hebrew commentators on the Bible, under the same form. When the Ark of the Lord was brought into the great temple of the idol at Ashdod, and the statue fell a second time, the head of Dagon and both the palms of his hands were cut off upon the threshold. Only the fishy part of Dagon was left to him. His worship appears to have extended over Syria, as well as Mesopotamia and Chaldea. He had many temples, as we learn from the Bible, in the country of the Philistines, and it was probably under the ruins of one of them that Samson buried the people of Gaza, who had gathered them together for to offer a great sacrifice unto Dagon, their god, and to rejoice. We also find a Beth Dagon, or the house of Dagon, amongst the uttermost cities of the children of Judah, and another city of the same name in the inheritance of the children of Asher. The first doorway, guarded by the fish gods, led into 2 small chambers opening into each other, and once panelled with bas-reliefs, the greater part of which had been destroyed. I shall call these chambers the chambers of records, for, like the house of the rolls, or records, which Darius ordered to be searched for the decree of Cyrus concerning the building of the Temple of Jerusalem, they appear to have contained the decrees of the Assyrian kings, as well as the archives of the empire. I have mentioned elsewhere that the historical records and public documents of the Assyrians were kept on tablets and cylinders of baked clay. Many specimens have been brought to this country. The importance of such relics will be readily understood. They present, in a small compass, an abridgment or recapitulation of the inscriptions on the great monuments and palace walls, giving in a chronological series the events of each monarch's reign. The writing is so minute, and the letters are so close one to another, that it requires considerable experience to separate and transcribe them. The chambers I am describing appear to have been a depository in the palace of Nineveh for such documents. To the height of a foot or more from the floor, they were entirely filled with them, some entire, but the greater part broken into many fragments, probably by the falling in of the upper part of the building. They were of different sizes. The largest tablets were flat, and measured about 9 inches by 6½ inches. The smaller were slightly convex, and some were not more than an inch long, with but 1 or 2 lines of writing. The cuneiform characters on most of them were singularly sharp and well defined, but so minute in some instances as to be almost illegible without a magnifying glass. These documents appear to be of various kinds. Many are historical records of wars and distant expeditions undertaken by the Assyrians. Some seem to be royal decrees, and are stamped with the name of a king, the son of Esarhaddon. Others again, divided into parallel columns by horizontal lines, contain lists of the gods, and probably a register of offerings made in their temples. On one, Dr. Hinks has detected a table of the value of certain cuneiform letters expressed by different alphabetical signs, according to various modes of using them, a most important discovery. On another, apparently a list of the sacred days in each month, and on a third, what seems to be a calendar. As we find from the Bavian inscriptions that the Assyrians kept a very accurate computation of time, we may reasonably expect to obtain valuable chronological tables and some information as to their methods of dividing the year, and even the day. Many are sealed with seals, and may prove to be legal contracts or conveyances of land. Others bear rolled impressions of those engraved cylinders so frequently found in Babylonia and Assyria, by some believed to be amulets. The characters appear to have been formed by a very delicate instrument before the clay was hardened by fire, and the process of accurately making letters so minute and complicated must have required considerable ingenuity and experience. On some tablets are found Phoenician or cursive Assyrian characters and other signs. The adjoining chambers contained similar relics, but in far smaller numbers. Many cases were filled with these tablets before I left Assyria, and a vast number of them have been found, I understand, since my departure. A large collection of them is already deposited in the British Museum. We cannot overrate their value. They furnish us with the materials for the complete decipherment of the cuneiform character, for restoring the language and history of Assyria, and for inquiring into the customs, sciences, and we may perhaps even add, literature of its people. The documents that have thus been discovered at Nineveh probably exceed all that have yet been afforded by the monuments of Egypt. But years must elapse before the innumerable fragments can be put together, and the inscriptions transcribed for the use of those who, in England and elsewhere, may engage in the study of the cuneiform character. It is to be hoped that the trustees of the British Museum will undertake the publication of documents of such importance to the history of the ancient world. The second entrance formed by the fish gods opened into a small chamber, whose sides had been lined with bas-reliefs, but there were no remains of inscriptions. A few days after our return to Mosul, I floated down the river on a raft to Nimrud. The flood which had spread over the plain during my absence in the desert had destroyed a part of the village. The centre of the plain of Nimrud was now a large lake, and the cultivated fields were overspread with slime. The Shemuti gathered round me as I arrived, and told me of crops destroyed and of houses swept away. The workmen had not been idle during my absence, and discoveries of considerable interest and importance had been made in the high mound on the level of the artificial platform. The first trenches had been opened in the side of the ravine between the ruins of the tower and those of the northwest palace. A pavement of large square bricks, bearing the usual superscription of the early Nimrud king, was soon uncovered. It led to a wall of sun-dried bricks, coated with plaster, which proved to be part of a small temple. I have already mentioned that a superstructure of bricks rested upon the stone basement wall of the tower at the northwest corner of the mound. It was against the eastern and southern faces of this upper building that the newly discovered temple abutted. 4 of its chambers were explored, chiefly by means of tunnels carried through the enormous mass of earth and rubbish in which the ruins were buried. The great entrances were to the east. The principal portal was formed by 2 colossal human-headed lions, 16 feet and a half high and 15 feet long. They were flanked by 3 small winged creatures, one above the other, and divided by an ornamental cornice, and between them was an inscribed pavement slab of alabaster. In front of each was a square stone, apparently the pedestal of an altar, and the walls on both sides were adorned with enamelled bricks. About 30 feet to the right, or north, of the lion gateway was a second entrance, at each side of which were 2 singular figures. One was that of a monster, whose head, of fanciful and hideous form, had long pointed ears and extended jaws, armed with huge teeth. Its body was covered with feathers, its 4 feet were those of a lion, its hind legs ended in the talons of an eagle, and it had spreading wings and the tail of a bird. Behind this strange image was a winged man, whose dress consisted of an upper garment with a skirt of skin or fur, an underrobe fringed with tassels, and the sacred horned hat. A long sword was suspended from his shoulders by an embossed belt. Sandals, armlets, and bracelets completed his attire. He grasped in each hand an object in the form of a double trident, resembling the thunderbolt of the Greek Jove, which he was in the attitude of hurling against the monster, who turned furiously towards him. This group appears to represent the bad spirit driven out by a good deity, a fit subject for the entrance to a temple dedicated to the god of war. The singular combination of forms by which the Assyrian sculptor portrayed the evil principle, so prominent an element in the Chaldean, and afterwards in the Magian, religious systems, cannot fail to strike the reader. On the slabs at right angles to these sculptures, forming the outer part of the entrance, were 2 colossal human figures, without wings, wearing garlands on their heads and bearing branches ending in 3 flowers. Within the temple, at right angles to the entrance, were sculptured fish gods, somewhat different in form from those in the palace of Gilgamesh. The fish's head formed part of the 3-horned cap usually worn by the winged figures. The tail only reached to the waist of the man, who was dressed in the tunic and long furred robe commonly seen in the bas-reliefs of Nimrud. To the right of this entrance, and apparently outside the walls of the temple, was discovered one of the finest specimens of Assyrian sculpture brought to this country. It represents the early Nimrud king, in high relief, carved on a solid block of limestone, cut into the shape of an arched frame, in the form of the rock tablets of Bavian and the Nar el-Kelb. The monarch wears his sacrificial robes, and carries the sacred mace in his left hand. Round his neck are hung the 4 sacred signs, the crescent, the star or sun, the trident, and the cross. His waist is encircled by the knotted cord, and in his girdle are 3 daggers. Above his head are the mythic symbols of Assyrian worship, the winged globe, the crescent, the star, the bident, and the horned cap. The entire slab, 8 foot 8 inches high by 4 foot 6 inches broad and 1 foot 3 inches thick, is covered behind and before, except where the sculpture intervenes, with an inscription, in small and admirably formed arrow-headed characters. Unfortunately, the heat of the fire which had consumed the building had also broken this monument into 2 pieces. From the carelessness shown in its transport to England, this fine specimen of Assyrian sculpture sustained still further injury, and the lower part is now almost destroyed. The inscription must have contained, when entire, several hundred lines, and is divided on the back of the slabs into 2 columns. It commences with an invocation to the god Ashur, the supreme lord, the king of the circle and of the 12 great gods. Then follow the names of these deities. The first name is Anu, the last Ishtar, probably Astarte, or the moon, and not Venus, as some have believed. After this invocation occurs the name of the founder of the Northwest Palace, read by Dr. Hinks, Assarabal, and by Colonel Rawlinson, Sardanapalus, by a long exordium, apparently of a religious nature, which has not yet been satisfactorily deciphered. Then follows a full account of his various campaigns and wars. The lion entrance led into a chamber 46 feet by 19 feet. Nearly opposite to the entrance was a doorway panelled with slabs sculptured with winged figures carrying maces. The inner door led into a chamber 47 feet by 31 feet, ending in a recess paved with one enormous alabaster slab, no less than 21 feet by 16 feet 7 inches, and 1 foot 1 inch thick. This monolith had been broken into several pieces, probably by the falling in of the roof of the building, and had in several places been reduced to lime by the burning beams of the ceiling. The whole of its surface, as well as the side facing the chamber, was occupied by one inscription, 325 lines in length, divided into 2 parallel horizontal columns, and carved with the greatest sharpness and care. On subsequently raising the detached pieces, I found that the back of the slab, resting on a solid mass of sun-dried bricks, was also covered with cuneiform writing, occupying 3 columns. It is difficult to understand why so much labour should have been apparently thrown away upon an inscription which would remain unseen until the edifice itself was utterly destroyed. Still more curious is the fact that, whilst this inscription contains all the historical details of that on the opposite side, the records of 2 or 3 more years are added, and that the upper inscription stops abruptly in the middle of a sentence. It is possible that the builders of the temple, foreseeing its ruin, had determined that if their enemies should through malice deface their annals, there should yet remain another record, inaccessible and unknown, which would preserve the history of their greatness and glory unto all time. The inscription on this great monolith appears to have been similar in its historical details to that on the king in the frame. I shall quote some specimens, translated by Dr. Hincks, to show the minuteness with which the Assyrian kings chronicled every event of their reign, and the consequent value of the historical records. It is to be remarked that, although these inscriptions are in the form of annals, the years are not mentioned. The king generally sets out on his campaigns in one particular month, the name of which is given, probably in the autumn, when the heats of summer were over. In the beginning of his reign, he collected his army, and made his first expedition into the country of Numi, or Numni, probably Elam or Susiana, subsequently, as we should find, called Numaki or Nubaki. He took many cities, towns, and districts whose names have not been identified. He slew their women, their slaves, and their children, and carried away their cattle and flocks. Their fighting men escaped to a hill fort? Their houses he burned like stubble? Many other countries to the south and southeast of Assyria, some of which are mentioned on the obelisk, were conquered during this campaign. The city of Nishtun? Is particularly described as one of considerable importance. He seized its king or governor, whose name reads Babu, the son of Babur, and imprisoned him in Babylon. At that time the cities of Nerib, their position is doubtful, their principal cities, he destroyed. From Nerib he departed to the city of Tushka. A palace for his dwelling he made there, and placed pillars at the gates, and put a statue of, probably some kind of stone, and set up tablets, and made a place for them in the citadel. An account follows of the building of the northwest palace of Nimrud, which, when deciphered, will be of considerable interest, and may enable us to restore that edifice. He also built 2 cities on the Euphrates, one on each bank, calling one after his own name, and the other after the name of the great god Ashur. Numerous expeditions to countries to the north, west, and south of Assyria are then related in detail. Among them one to Carchemish, where he received the tribute of Sangara, king of the Khatti, the Hittites or people of Syria, including a great variety of gold and silver ornaments, some apparently to be recognized by their pure Hebrew names. As few of the cities and countries conquered and visited by this king have yet been identified, and a mere repetition of the same dry details would scarcely interest the reader, I will merely give literal versions, as far as they can be given, of the history of 2 of the most important campaigns. They will show the style of these remarkable chronicles, and the minuteness with which events were recorded. The first paragraph relates to the campaign of the king on the borders of the Euphrates. On the 22nd day of the month, I departed from Kalach, the quarter of Nineveh now called Nimrud. I crossed the Tigris. On the banks of the Tigris I received much tribute. In the city of Tabit I halted. I occupied the banks of the river Karma, the Hermus, or eastern confluent of the Kabul. In the city of Megaris I halted. From the city of Megaris I departed. I occupied the banks of the Kabul, Chabaras. I halted at the city of Sadikani, or Kardikani. I received the tribute of the city of Kedni. From Kedni, I departed to the city of Lemni. In the city of Lemni, I halted. From the city of Lemni, I departed. In the city of Beth-Khilapi, I halted. The tribute of Beth-Khilapi I received, gold and silver, and many other articles, amongst which are apparently objects of clothing or embroidered stuffs. Then follow his marches day by day to the cities of Sirki, Sufri, Nakwarabani, and Kindani, from each of which he received tribute in gold, silver, several objects not identified, cattle, and sheep. The inscription goes on. The city of Kindani stands on the right bank of the river Euphrates. From Kindani I departed. On the mountain by the side of the Euphrates I halted. From the mountain I departed. In Beth Shebaiah, over against Karid, I halted. The city of Karid stands on the right bank of the river Euphrates. From Beth Shebaiah I departed. On the top of, or above, Anat, I halted. Anat stands in the middle of the Euphrates, agreeing with the position of the modern town of Anna. He then attacked and took the principal city of Shadu, of the country of Sukkah, and the city of Tsur, the capital of Shadu, whose inhabitants were assisted by the soldiers of Bishi, a nation also alluded to in the second year of the Annals as Sennacherib. Nebobaladin, king of Kardunias, is then mentioned, showing that the campaign was carried down the banks of the Euphrates, far to the south of Babylon. The second extract is from the records of a campaign in northern Syria. Having first crossed the Euphrates, from Kunulua, the capital of Lubana, the Sharutinian, I departed. The Arantu, Orontes, I crossed. On the bank of the Arantu I encamped. From the banks of the Arantu I departed. Between the countries of Saraban and Tapan, I occupied the country. By the seashore I encamped. To the city of Adiboa, a principal city of Lubana, the Sharutinian, I returned. Undeciphered passage. I caused some men of Assyria to dwell in his palace, Whilst I was in Adiboa, the cities of Lukuta I took. I slew many of their men. I overthrew and burned their cities. Their fighting men, or the deserters from my army, I laid hold of. On stakes over against their city I impaled them. At that time the countries that are upon the Lebanon I took possession of, to the great sea of the country of Akari, the Mediterranean. On the great sea I put my servants, sacrifices to the gods I offered. The tribute of the kings of the people who dwelt near the sea, of the Tyrians, the Sidonians, the Kubalians, the Mahalatai, the Ma'ai, and the Akkadians, all nations to the north of the Tyre, and of the city of Arvad, which is in the middle of the sea, silver and gold pieces, rings, of copper, ingots, of copper, 2 kinds of clothing, perhaps the dyed cloth of Tyre, or embroidery such as are frequently mentioned in the Bible, great yagoti and small pagoti, meaning not determined, some wooden objects apparently of cedar, and pearls, from the rivers at or between the sea. I went to the mountain of Kamana, the Kamenus, in the north of Syria. I sacrificed to the gods. I made bridges, or beams, and pillars, From Kamana I brought them to Bithkara, for my own house, for the temple of the sun. I went to the forests and cut them down, and made bridges, or roofs or beams, of the wood, for Ishtar, mistress of the city of Nineveh, my protectress. The chief events of the reign of this king are briefly alluded to in the standard and other inscriptions discovered in the northwest palace at Nimrud, but in the records just described we have a minuteness of geographical detail which enables us to trace the course of his expeditions with great certainty. Standing one day on a distant part of the mound, I smelt the sweet smell of burning cedar. The Arab workmen, excavating in the small temple, had dug out a beam, and, the weather being cold, had at once made a fire to warm themselves. The wood was cedar, probably one of the very beams mentioned in the inscription as brought from the forests of Lebanon by the king who built the edifice. After a lapse of nearly 3,000 years, it had retained its original fragrance. It is likely that the whole superstructure, as well as the roof and floor of the building, like those of the Temple and Palace of Solomon, were of this precious material. In these ruins was also found a mass of lead melted by the fire, for embedded in it was the iron head of a hatchet. Amongst the various small objects collected were figures of winged deities, etc., of clay coloured in the mass with a blue derived from copper, eyes, beards, hair, and ornaments in enamel, probably belonging to figures of wood, metal, or ivory, resembling the chrysophelantine statues of the Greeks, eyes of black marble inlaid with ivory, with the eyeballs of a bright blue enamel belonging to similar statues, and arms, legs, and other parts of figures in charred wood. Fragments of porcelain, parts of a cup or vase, with carvings in low relief, several inscribed fragments of agate, lapis lazuli, cornelian, and other precious materials, beads, cylinders, and 1 or 2 clay tablets with inscriptions and impressions of seals, complete the list of small objects discovered in this temple. About 100 feet to the east of the building last described, and on the very edge of the artificial platform, I discovered a second temple. Its principal entrance faced the south, and was on the same level as the northwest palace. This gateway was formed by 2 colossal lions with extended jaws, gathered up lips and nostrils, flowing manes and ruffs of bristly hair. The heads, though to a certain extent conventional in form, were designed with that vigour so remarkably displayed by the Assyrian sculptor in the delineation of animals. The limbs conveyed the idea of strength and power, the veins and muscles were accurately portrayed, and the outline of the body was not deficient in grace and truth. But the front of the animal, which was in full, was narrow and cramped, and unequal in dignity to the side. The sculptor has given 5 legs to the animal for the same reason that he gave them to the sphinxes, that they may offer a complete front and side view. This gateway, about 8 feet wide, was paved with 1 inscribed slab. The height of the lions was about 8 feet, and their length 13. An inscription was carved across them. In front of them, in the corners formed by walls projecting at right angles with the entrance, were 2 altars, hollow at the top, and ornamented with gradines resembling the battlements of a castle. The exterior walls appeared to have been adorned with enamelled bricks, many of which still remained. Unfortunately, one of these lions had been too much injured by fire to bear removal. The other, although cracked in several places when discovered, and consequently moved in pieces, has been preserved and is now in the British Museum. The lion portal led into a chamber 57 feet by 25. At one end was a recess similar to that in the opposite temple, and also paved with 1 great alabaster slab, inscribed on both sides. This monolith, 19.5 feet by 12 feet, was likewise broken into several pieces, and had been injured in parts by fire. The inscription on the upper side, divided into 2 columns and containing 230 lines, was nearly the same as that on the king in the frame and on the monolith in the other temple. It was also a record of the wars and campaigns of the early Nimrud king. The other rooms in the same building contained no inscriptions, sculptures, or other objects of interest. In the earth above the great inscribed slab was found an interesting figure, 3 feet 4 inches high, and cut in a hard, compact limestone. It appeared to represent the king himself, attired as high priest in his sacrificial robes. In his right hand he held an instrument resembling a sickle, and in his left the sacred mace. Round his waist was the knotted girdle, and his left arm, like that of the king in the opposite temple, was partly concealed by an outer robe. His garments descended to his feet, the toes alone projecting from them. The beard and hair were elaborately curled, the features were majestic, and the general proportions of the statue not altogether incorrect, with the exception of a want of breadth in the side view peculiar to Assyrian works of art of this nature. It was, however, chiefly remarkable as being the only entire statue in the round of this period hitherto discovered in the ruins of Nineveh. On the breast is an inscription nearly in these words, after the name and titles of the king: "The conqueror from the upper passage of the Tigris to Lebanon and the Great Sea, who all countries from the rising of the sun to the going down thereof has reduced under his authority." The statue was, therefore, probably raised after his return from the campaign in Syria described, as we have seen, on the monoliths, and alluded to in the standard inscription. The statue originally stood on a pedestal of reddish limestone, which, with the figure itself, was found broken into several pieces. They have been restored and are now in the British Museum. The two interesting buildings just described, the only undoubted remains of temples hitherto found at Nimrud, complete the discoveries at the northern extremity of the mound. They enable us, as will hereafter be seen, to restore part of the group of edifices raised on the grand platform in this quarter of Nineveh. End of Chapter 16. Recording by Sabrina Jazz Ainsworth.